The day of my husband's will reading, the sky was a flat, colorless gray. The kind that makes everything feel unfinished. Like even the world itself wasn't ready to move on. And I remember standing at the window in my bedroom long before anyone arrived, watching the driveway as if it could tell me who my children had become before they even stepped out of their cars. Because grief has a way of sharpening truths you spent years trying to soften. And by the time the first car door slammed shut, I already knew this wasn't going to be about their father, it was going to be about everything they believed they were owed. I heard heels on the pavement, hurried voices, the familiar rhythm of people rehearsing sorrow. And when I finally walked into the living room, they were already there, dressed in black that looked more like performance than mourning. Their eyes scanning the house, not lingering on memories, not pausing at the photographs, but moving across the walls, the furniture, the quiet weight of everything their father and I had built over 42 years. As if they were silently calculating value instead of loss. And my eldest son, Daniel, was the first to speak. His voice low and measured in a way that would have impressed his father once, but now felt rehearsed. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, though he didn't wait for an answer before glancing at the hallway where the lawyer would soon appear. And my daughter Lila stood near the fireplace, arms folded tightly, her grief contained but her impatience leaking through the small taps of her fingers against her sleeve, while the youngest, Marcus, paced just enough to betray his discomfort. Not with loss, but with uncertainty. And I sat down quietly, smoothing my dress over my knees, realizing that, in this moment, I wasn't just their mother anymore, I was the gatekeeper of everything they thought was coming to them. And when the doorbell rang, cutting through the silence like a final warning, I felt something inside me settle, not break, not ache, but solidify. Because this day wasn't about losing my husband all over again. It was about finally seeing clearly what I had refused to name for years. We gathered in the dining room where so many birthdays, holidays, and quiet Sunday dinners had once unfolded. But today the table felt colder, stripped of warmth, reduced to a surface where expectation sat heavier than grief. And, as the lawyer began speaking in his careful, practiced tone, outlining legal formalities and timelines, I watched my children's faces not for sadness but for reaction, for flickers of anticipation, for the subtle tightening of their jaws whenever numbers or assets were mentioned. And it didn't take long before the shift happened. Before the room transformed from a place of remembrance into something transactional. Because when the house was mentioned, this house, the one they grew up in, the one their father painted with his own hands, the one that held every version of them, they leaned forward almost in unison, as if pulled by an invisible thread, and Daniel cleared his throat, asking questions that sounded respectful on the surface but carried an edge of entitlement underneath. Leela interrupted twice to clarify values. Not memories, and Marcus, who had always been the quietest, asked the one question that said everything without saying it directly. "So how is everything being divided?" And I remember the lawyer pausing, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he understood something they didn't yet, that what they expected and what existed were no longer the same thing. And when he finally spoke, explaining that certain assets were no longer part of the estate, that ownership had changed months prior, I watched confusion ripple across their faces. First subtle, then sharp, then undeniable, and for a moment, they looked at each other instead of at me, as if one of them might have the missing piece, but none of them did. Because none of them had been there, not during the long evenings when your father's breathing grew shallow, not during the mornings when silence felt heavier than illness, not during the months when I made decisions alone, quietly, deliberately, without calling, without asking, without waiting. Because somewhere along the way, I had stopped believing they would show up for anything that didn't benefit them. The tension in the room thickened as the lawyer continued, his words precise but heavy, explaining that the majority of assets, including the house, the savings, the land, had already been legally transferred. And I could feel the moment land like a crack beneath their feet. Because this wasn't just unexpected, it was unthinkable to them, and Daniel was the first to react, his composure slipping just enough to reveal the anger beneath it. "Transferred to who?" he asked, though I think he already knew the answer. Or at least feared it. And when the lawyer said my name, clearly and without hesitation, the silence that followed wasn't grief, it was shock edged with something colder. Something sharper, and Lila let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh, the kind people use when reality doesn't match the version they've already written in their minds. That doesn't make sense, she said, shaking her head while Marcus stopped pacing altogether, his stillness louder than any outburst, and all three of them turned to me at once. Not as children looking to their mother for comfort, but as claimants looking at the person who had just altered their expectations. And in that moment, I saw it clearly, not just who they were now, but how long they had been this way. How every missed call, every shortened visit, every excuse wrapped in busyness had slowly carved distance between us. Not accidental, not unavoidable, but chosen. And I folded my hands in my lap, steady, calm, almost detached. Because I had already lived through the part where this hurt, and what remained now was clarity. And when I finally spoke, my voice didn't tremble, didn't rise, didn't seek approval. It simply stated what had been true long before this room. It makes perfect sense, I said. And they stared at me as if I had just become someone else. Someone unfamiliar, someone they hadn't accounted for. But the truth was, I hadn't changed, I had just stopped pretending. You moved everything. Without telling us? Daniel's voice carried a mixture of disbelief and accusation, as though silence itself had been a betrayal, and I met his gaze without flinching. Because what he was really asking wasn't about legality, it was about expectation. About the quiet assumption that they had a claim simply by being present at the end. And Lila stepped forward, her composure cracking into something more raw, more emotional, but not in the way grief looks. More in the way disappointment does when it collides with entitlement. "We're your children," she said, as if that sentence alone should undo everything I had done. As if it carried weight independent of action, and Marcus finally spoke again. Softer, but no less pointed. "Why would you do this?" And that question lingered longer than the others, not because it deserved more, but because it revealed something they still didn't understand, that this wasn't sudden. It wasn't impulsive, it wasn't even about the will itself. And I took a slow breath, not to steady myself, but to give them a moment to sit in the discomfort they had avoided for years. And when I answered, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances like accusations. I simply told them the truth they had been too distant to hear. "Because I already lost you," I said, and the room shifted again. Not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally. Like something invisible had been acknowledged for the first time. And I watched their expressions struggle to process that, not because they didn't understand the words, but because they had never considered themselves absent, never framed their distance as abandonment. And I continued, not to hurt them, but to finish something that had been unfinished for far too long. "You stopped coming unless there was a reason. You stopped calling unless you needed something. And when your father got sick, you visited like it was an obligation, not a moment you might never get back." And no one interrupted me. Not because they agreed, but because somewhere, beneath the defensiveness, there was recognition, and I leaned back slightly, my voice softening but not weakening. "You thought you were waiting for your father to pass," I said, letting the words settle fully before finishing. "But I was waiting to see who you'd become." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy with realization, resistance, and the slow, uncomfortable shift from expectation to consequence. And for the first time since they arrived, none of them spoke immediately, because there was nothing left to argue that didn't expose something deeper, something they weren't ready to confront. And I stood up slowly, not in anger, not in triumph, but with the quiet finality of someone who had already made peace with her decision long before this moment. And I looked around the room one last time, not at them as they were now, but at the echoes of who they had once been. The children who ran through these halls, who laughed at this table, who believed this house was a place of belonging rather than value. And I realized that letting go of the house had been easier than letting go of that version of them. But both were necessary, and I walked toward the window, glancing out at the same gray sky that had greeted me that morning, only now it felt different. Not lighter, but clearer, and when I spoke again, it wasn't to explain, it was to close something. "I've already sold the house," I said. And I could feel the impact of those words without turning around. The land is gone too. The accounts have been transferred. Everything that was once ours. Simply a means, and finally I faced them again. Meeting each of their eyes not with anger, but with something steadier. Something they might one day understand. "I'm leaving," I said. "Not because I don't love you, but because I finally chose myself," and Lila's lips parted as if to respond. Daniel's posture stiffened. Marcus looked down at his hands. But none of them stopped me because deep down, they knew this moment didn't belong to them anymore, and I picked up my bag. The only thing I had kept for myself without explanation. And walked toward the door, not waiting for permission. Not looking back for approval, because the truth was, I had already said goodbye long before today, and as the door closed behind me, it didn't feel like loss, it felt like release. Like stepping into a life that no longer required me to be everything for people who had slowly chosen to be nothing for me. And somewhere in that quiet, in that unfamiliar freedom, I realized that this wasn't the end of something. It was the first honest beginning I had allowed myself in years.